Hello, everybody. So I'm really happy that we're going to continue the voyage that was begun last week into the untold history of China. That's one way of looking at it, at least. Or at least a reconceptualization of Chinese history from a slightly more critical eye than we are usually privy to when we are given some oversimplistic garbage that is completely devoid of any insights into the reality of what has been shaping the last in the case of what Lee did last week was several thousand years of universal world history, but especially the last 150 or so years that has really confused a lot of people who I think we're discovering now more and more since the Cold War propaganda machine is really going on hyperdrive. A lot of the same tropes and spells and charms that were used to turn people into um, a mobbish frenzy of people tattling on their neighbors for being potential commies during the 50s and 60s that really took the US into an insane like hellscape, not only internationally as the US became more and more of a CIA MI6 run empire, but even internally where children were ratting on their parents for and telling their teachers that I heard my parents speaking about anti-imperial language, which is a sign that you're dealing with communists. And so people were driven nuts, and we still haven't come to terms with a lot of the FBI-run dictatorship and the whole psyop of the 50s. And because we haven't come to terms with it or admitted what happened to us as a collective West, we have left ourselves very susceptible to having a lot of these same psychological profiles of prejudices and other things revived by using the same techniques by the same Five Eyes directed media agencies that are able to make things up literally out of thin air in order to get us to avoid looking at what is the real agency controlling our world, and instead give our focus and our hate and our fear over to either Russia or China. So Lee did a really good job and was going through a lot of history, but due to the massive substance and the content, we had to sort of pull back and break his class up into two to give the topic the full breath it needed to breathe and for people to be able to ask some questions. So today we're going to pick up where we left off. For those who have missed the first part, who might be listening on YouTube, click on the links in the description box, and you'll be able to listen to part one of this presentation. But you'll still get something out of listening to this presentation today, which is going to go through some controversial stuff, but it has to be said, it has to be developed, and I'm very happy that it's being done. So, Lee, with that, it is all yours.
Fantastic. Okay, let me just share my screen. Okay, I'm guessing you guys can see that.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So last time we caught ourselves up. I'm gonna try not to waste too much time because there's a lot to go through. But like you said, if anyone didn't watch the previous one, that would be pretty helpful just to kind of get some of that background all on the same page. There are still, though, a few little things just to understand as we now get into this time period, and we'll really be looking at the rise of the Communist Party in China and what was actually going on, and then some of that added context, which if you didn't get that in the Western media or the Western retelling of the history, it can totally change and reshape in your mind what was really going on, what the actual facts were, as opposed to just kind of being a little pawn to what they want you to think was going on. So with that being said, so there was a clip that I want to show first, I guess. So let me just open that up.
Of families, the family boat is their only possession in the world. The sampan is their home in every sense of the word. They cook their meals, eat and sleep there, and gain a slender livelihood from the sale of fish that they catch, or from the delivery of small cargoes of freight. Along the riverfront in this crowded city, the houses rest on stilts to protect them against floodwaters. This, of course, is Chongqing, temporary capital of China. This ancient city was abruptly transported into the brutal realities of the 20th century in 1938, when Nanking fell, and the government needed a new capital. They chose Chongqing, 1,100 miles to the west, deep in the interior, beyond the rugged mountains. It was as if we had moved our own government from Washington over the Alleghenies and beyond the Mississippi, without railroads or highways to travel on. Chongqing is famous for its steps, as London is famous for its bridges, and New York for its skyscrapers. From the river's edge to the heart of the city, the pedestrian must climb a total of 360 steps, for Chongqing is built on and around a mountain. Now we are on the great Yangtze River, which flows by Chongqing from its sources in the eternal snows of the mountains of Tibet and continues on eastward through the heart of China to the China Sea at Shanghai. The gorges of the Yangtze are world famous for their majestic beauty. Navigating the turbulent Yangtze is a stiff challenge to the crew of one finds the task of rowing impossible, and so wades to shore and takes up the job on land. It's a desperately hard job. Scenes like these have no counterpart anywhere in the world. This boat has found still.
You guys saw the video, right?
Yep. Yeah, we saw and heard the video.
Okay, cool. So that I shared to provide a little bit of context, because although it's easy to talk about a lot of this stuff, actually understanding the situation, that was very strange for us to see, but 90% of the country of China at that time, that was the kind of existence that people were living in. And that was even a situation where you would be better off than some people, because if you had a job doing something like that, now obviously steam engines were already invented. In other parts of the world, boats were sailing up and down rivers under their own power. You wouldn't use people getting out and pulling it. Today, people might think that a situation like those, people pulling that boat, would be something that would exist under communism, as they might believe, or as they might see it in their head. But in reality, that was more reflective of the situation people already were in, due to systems that weren't communism, but rather the situation we kind of saw in the last one, kind of falling into. So you can imagine people were feeling desperate at that point, but it gets even worse, because beyond that, we had the famines and starvation. So there was a series of famines, and now people have called China the land of famine because of this. And when this was written, quote you see, that was 1920. So that was before anything related to a communist famine or anything like that had ever occurred. But already there had been a long history of this. So as an example, from 1876 to 1879, about 100 million people were affected in the North China famine. At least 9.5 to 13 million people died. Then again in 1920 to 1921, same area in the north of China, 500,000 people died. from another famine. And then just after that, there was a series of floods. So floods were displacing about 4 million people. And when you would get a flood and it would wash out the crops, again, you would have a lot of people who would be starving as well. So a flood would also often result in a starvation event as well. In 1931, the Yangtze and Hui river systems, they both experienced massive flooding, and that affected about 30 million people. Things began to get worse and worse, though, because as the strong central government of the Qing dynasty, remember, we saw that that was already gone by this point. So as in that void that was left, you had the British with their customs service doing a lot of the overall management of certain aspects of the country, such as collecting tariffs, collecting those trade taxes. But we've seen that by 1896, almost more than 100% of that money they were collecting from the customs service, from the salt cabal, all of these foreign-owned agencies, they were taking 100% of that already to finance like the loans which they had given to the central government, which were mainly going towards purchases from Western countries. So that wasn't very beneficial to these people. But in that vacuum, you also had warlords popping up. So all over the country, these warlords would go in, and what they would do is they would collect tax from the peasants. Now, taxing peasants of food has been something that had existed in China for almost 2,000 years. But with these warlords doing it, they would often come and go. You could get multiple warlords in a period of time. So the average peasant, there's a stat that in Sichuan province, people were getting taxed 50 to 75% of everything they could grow. So you can imagine if you also had these kind of issues with natural disasters and whatnot, the floods and stuff, you'd be in a situation where you really would be destitute. Whenever that river flooded in 1931, that was actually related to the fact that the nationalist leader, he dynamited the river in an effort to supposedly slow down Japan's advance. Well, that shows that in some instances, the floods would be because of a lack of upkeep, which again, you would need a strong central government for. But further to that, even worse, in this situation, it was actually caused by a negligent government. But another statistic, which is equally surprising to people, is, and this really speaks to just the picture that was going on, in Shanghai, which was run by foreigners, they kept records of a lot of stuff. And one thing they kept a record of was how many bodies they were picking up off the streets every year. This is directly from those sources. And when you look at the total there, that's not an error. They, over the course from 1915 to 1949, 1947, they picked up about 750,000 bodies off the streets of Shanghai. Now, it sounds hard to believe. One aspect to that, which might kind of make a bit more sense, was the fact that people had a certain belief that if a body wasn't like buried correctly, that would be bad. So in some instances, it wasn't that the person just flopped dead. It was that they died and their family would put them in a coffin. They couldn't afford to do anything else. And the coffins were actually being distributed for free for people to take advantage of the service. And they would leave them in the open coffin on the street. So there was an element of that going on, but then there was also a significant element of this where it was just situations of people dying with no family to look after them, because people would also go here to try to like maybe hope that there was some source of money or food or something. And a lot of it was children as well. the little zoom pictures are covering it up, but there's a whole column for children too. Now, at this time, obviously, you would hope that there would be some sort of a solution, an uprising, whatever you might call it. And there was talk, in the Western media, especially whenever they would reference the issues in China, they would mention that there were a group of people, they call it the student movement. There was a new culture movement going on, and this was really centered with the students in the schools and the universities. But what people noticed was that they were kind of all over the place. They were repeating a lot of foreign talking points, different foreign concepts, and we'll get into that a bit later, like what exactly was the reason they were feeling so strongly about these. But what was noted was that it really led to a lot of division among them. So they didn't really have a cohesive plan necessarily to try to solve the problem. They were all just kind of pontificating on the various Western philosophies. So you saw those people pulling that boat, right? You saw the way the typical people were dressed in the famine situations. Well, looking at these students, right? This is the student movement, which a lot of the hope was being pinned on. You can see it's a bit of a different situation, just even how they look. Like, you can tell that they're very well dressed. They're wearing like freshly laundered clothes, right? Like bright white clothes. Even the outfits on the top right, you can kind of tell that those are people of a higher level of status, a higher level of society, and you definitely wouldn't be wrong if you kind of made that observation. In fact, in all of China, these university students who were kind of promoted as being really the source for the salvation, the thing that was going to get us out of this problem, especially to Westerners as well. Whenever they would hear about the situation in China, they would hear mostly about these up and coming student leaders who were vying to be the ones to put China back on the right track. But that only represented about 0.26% of the population of the country. This is a campus of one of the universities in Beijing, and you can see that apart, like far from the situation that the average people were in, right? This looks like a comparative paradise. They have a little lake on their campus. They're having a tea party in that bottom picture. So it really was it was a tale of two different worlds, and I think this is important to recognize. So when you would have had people at this time in the 1920s, and they'd be studying ways to solve the problem, and they would be reading that there's an issue of maybe classes, and there could be an upper class which is disconnected from reality and maybe not actually equipped to solve the problem. And whenever Marxism first made its way to China as one of these many movements that I mentioned, there were a few people who read that and thought, hey, this actually sort of explains something. This sort of explains why we're not making much progress on solving our problems, despite the fact we're empowering the students who are ostensibly the very top of the society, right? It was the children of the people who could afford the money to get their kids to be in that 0.2%. And there's a long history in China of scholars basically being revered as the leaders of the country. So even more so, hope would have been placed in them, but it just wasn't playing out. However, luckily, maybe for China, there was a different sort of movement which was starting to pick up steam, and this one was a little different. So across the country, if you've heard of the Boxer Rebellion, for example, so that occurred in 1900, that was one of those failed uprisings against the Qing government towards the end. And one of the things the Boxers were known for was being against foreigners. Partly, I think we've seen because of the situation it was pushing China into, of this increasing poverty, with no new government really coming to solve the problem, because it's like the old government was intentionally being kept on life support. It wasn't capable of doing any of the central control, which would have kept people fed, would have all those things we saw in the past dynasties made for a strong period, right? The mandate of heaven was when the world was in order and chaos was just continuing. But what happened was, although the Boxer Rebellion failed, more and more peasants started taking matters into their own hands. And what started appearing were peasants' associations, peasants' militias. There was one well-known one called the Red Spear Society. You see them practicing on the left. And essentially, these were groups of from the vast majority of the country, right? It was about 90%, 88% of people were this peasant class. They were also 85% illiterate, but they knew that the situation was getting so dire and people were starving left and right that they figured that they would try to kind of band together. One of the reasons was because I said those warlords kept coming through. So they felt, at the very least, if a warlord comes and we're all armed with spears and these weapons, at the very least we can fight them off. Now, as I said, in the cities, the idea was very different. The idea was the revolution will come from the students, right? And especially because they were all reading the Western theories, it was believed that they would be the source of the cause, but the cause of the restoration, whatever would come next would come from them, was the idea. But one person who was from one of these villages returned back home, and that was who we've all heard of, which is Mao Zedong. So he was actually from Hunan province, and he took the time to go back and visit again during one of these movements. So and this was in 1927. So for a little background, the Communist Party was formed in China in 1921, but as we saw those students, that was pretty much the situation it was formed under. You could almost think of it like an overglorified university club at that time. But Mao, who had been from one of these villages, but who had been able to go study there, he had always felt, from everything he's written, like a bit of an outsider. He had an accent. He talked a bit different because of his dialect than people. The way he dressed was a little bit more like a peasant, because his family didn't necessarily come from the money that you would see some of those other students how they were dressed. So he was always kind of not really taken that seriously by people in school, but he had joined, and what he lacked in his upper class status, he made up for through his desire to actually learn and maybe think a bit creatively. And you see that appearing time and time again. And so this was one of the first things he published, which was his report on that visit. So I actually have a copy of it translated here. So you can see here, this was the report that he wrote, and there were a lot of observations that he made while he was there. He said, during my recent visit to Hunan, I made a first-hand investigation of the conditions in 5 counties of, I'm not going to try to pronounce all of these because it'll be embarrassing. In 32 days from January 4th to February 5th, I called for fact-finding conferences in the villages and county towns, which works attended by experienced peasants and by comrades working in the peasant movement. And I listened attentively to their reports and collected a great deal of material. Many of the hows and whys of the peasant movement were the exact opposite of what the gentry in Hankow and Changsha are saying. So in other words, members of those students groups and those people who are supposed to be the leaders of whatever change might occur, which didn't really seem to be making much progress, they were saying that there was no hope in even engaging with the vast majority of these people, right? They said that the solution will come from us. But he said that when he got there, he found that, in fact, a lot of the things they were saying about them wasn't true. They were organized, they were effective, and they seemed to actually have the ability to make real progress. This is where he says, all talk against the peasant movement must be speedily set right. All the wrong measures taken by revolutionary authorities concerning the peasant movement must be changed. And I think one of the things he's most impressed with are the numbers. So he's saying that at first the numbers did not exceed 300 to 400,000, but within a very short period of time, the numbers increased, and it was several million. And then he's saying about how whole families are joining these peasants associations, and how he's seeing that this appears to be a movement which actually has a lot more potential than anything that they had been seeing so far. He goes through and he reports how these warlord type people, right? And something to be aware of too, which is used to kind of fool Westerners when they try to understand this stuff, is the term landlords. So when we think of a landlord, we might imagine the person we rent our apartment from. But in this context, a landlord is like a feudal style landlord. So during this period, especially, this was just rapidly developing, where people would accumulate a large amount of land, and they would then have their own small militia. The peasants who wanted to farm the land would have to pay whatever taxes they wanted. So here he's saying how essentially this is the group that they're fighting against, because as you can see, millions of people are dying. There kind of makes sense why after up to a certain point, people they'll grab a spear if they have to try to protect themselves. But while a lot of people are dismissing them, he's not, and he goes through and kind of outlines why they should be working with them, and he takes notes on how to organize these associations. He takes notes on the way in which they go about, and he talks about how they'll actually give fines to these landlords. It's not necessarily just that they're like killing them. Some of the landlords got locked up, so it's a growing movement, and this document was really one of the first times people really heard of who he was. And in a short period of time, from him meeting with these peasants and doing this fact-finding mission, the leadership in the Communist Party of China dramatically changed. So the previous leader of it, he actually was voted out. He left, and he's someone you often see now in everything that was written after that period, which was 1928, slandered and talked about as somebody who was extremely dogmatic and radically left, but it wasn't actually based on any meaningful understanding of what was really going on. So that was the PDF we looked at. But as time passed, this strategy worked a lot better, and they accumulated more and more territory. throughout all the countryside, basically everywhere where there were peasants, they were having dramatic gains. So in 1946, so just one thing that also occurred right before this was they had their National Congress. It was the Seventh National Congress meeting, and this was where Mao Zedong was made. He was already chairman, but he was also made the head of the Secretariat, which is the group that does the day-to-day managing of the party. So as we get into this now, so it's we're getting into 1949. So we're going to see what did they do when they took power. There's something important to consider as well, quickly, and that's the system that the rest of the world was going to be operating on. So in the rest of the world, following the end of the war, there was the Bretton Woods Agreement. Now, I'm sure most people know of the Bretton Woods Agreement, but the dynamic that was playing out there that's really important to keep in mind is that the British were in a situation where the war that they had done nothing to kind of head off, World War II, had in a roundabout way put them in a pretty desperate position, because they had then had to spend so much of the gold they had accumulated on purchases from America. Not only did that dramatically grow America's industry, but it also created a situation where the British, A, their industry was depleted, and B, they had no gold. So going into Bretton Woods, John Maynard Keynes, who we know as maybe an economist, he was also the head negotiator on the British side. And a lot of the things that he weaved in to the system, they are designed to make sense on the surface when you think of them in a purely rational ivory tower sort of way. But as soon as you move a bit deeper and actually try to understand whether it will be beneficial or not, or whether it's even really going to lead you to the correct conclusion, you realize a lot of it is more so designed to trap you. And I think that's what he's talking about here in this quote. He's kind of acknowledging the fact that people will believe these concepts, such as a balance of payment, which was the rule which the IMF, which he also proposed creating, which was created, was really designed to police countries and ensure that a country that was importing from the rest of the world could only import the amount they export, and vice versa. Now, this was designed to do two things. One thing it was actually designed to do in his initial proposal was to harm the US, because originally there was even a clause in there that the US should be, or anybody who exports too much should actually be penalized, because it's almost like they aren't playing by the rules, which would, of course, penalize the US. Now, the American negotiators didn't allow that specific part to go through, but the part where you're very strictly forced to only import the amount that you can export within a very, very brief period of time, that did get through. So the IMF, which one of their number one rules is surveillance, to actually surveil economies, to gather all this data and ensure that people are either in a balance, or if they're not in a balance, they would offer you loans. Now, the thing that this cartoon is kind of making fun of is a lot of the time they might offer you a loan, but the loan would come with conditions attached. And a lot of the time those conditions would then actually hinder you from doing the things that you should really be doing to develop your country properly. So if you're trying to invest in certain industrial projects, that might be a condition that, no, sorry, we'll give you some money to help you cover the imports you need, but you can only use it on what we've determined to be okay. And that's in this cartoon, they're making fun of the fact that's basically like throwing your luggage overboard, what little you have or what little progress you're making, in order to get them to give you some kind of help. So this would be the situation that they would be really going up against. But there was another situation too. So the former government, in the lead up to 1949, from 1937, had been printing their own paper currency. And it's widely regarded, although everyone always talks about Weimar Germany, maybe the reason they don't bring this one up is because of what happened next. But this was also one of the situations of the highest levels of inflation that have ever been recorded. So the currency of the previous government, when they created it, 100 of it would buy 2 cows. But by 1949, when they were essentially fleeing to Taiwan, the currency they created would buy 0.00245 grams of a rice. So you can see not a good situation to be in, but it was also a bit of a problem for the government when they came in. Like, what would they do with this existing currency that was obviously floating around? You can't just tell people the money they have is worth nothing. They realized they would probably have to honor it in some way, but then also, how do they stop and break this chain of inflation? So this is a quote from the selected works of Chen Yun. Chen Yun is someone who's almost never talked about, but he was one of the highest ranking people throughout the Mao period. And he was the person who was more in charge of handling these financial matters, because there's kind of only so much one person can do. So there was actually a lot of delegation of power going on. And he points out here that while the peasants are obviously very happy that they had just won, they're now in a new problem, that they're hoping that they'll be able to get back to a situation of price stability, but they don't know if they'll be able to. And he says this basically means that whatever they do next, right, because of the hopes that the people have, they probably can't just go back to what had been being done before, which was printing banknotes to finance the government. But then the question is, so wait, how could they finance the government? So with the creation of their new currency, one of the first things they did was decide that they needed to anchor it at all times to a physical value. And one of the things Chen Yun wrote was, where they can, they should always purchase any goods from people in the countryside, because that would support them. It would get dollars in their hands, which they would probably need to exchange for other things, but it would also allow them to stabilize prices. And the other thing he was saying here was they needed to always allow the free flow of commodities. So now I'm just going to pull up specifically what he actually wrote. So, and this actually kind of ties into a larger thing, right? Where they want your base level ideas surrounding China's communist government to be one where it was just one mad person just doing whatever they wanted, going and choosing policies out of nowhere. But in reality, there was so much thought going on. So when Chen Yun was writing this, right, he was going through all the issues that they were facing, and that was why I just wanted to briefly show you guys some of what they were actually up against. So for one thing, he was recognizing that they were being blockaded, and he was saying that they should be prepared for that to continue. So the U.S. and a bunch of other countries had them surrounded on the coastline, so they were unable to export or import at that period of time. But then they were also considering the factories, and they were noting how the factories that they have, they might need to move them. They might need to move them inland where they would be safer, but at the same time, a lot of them were damaged. He's noting the price of grain had risen at least twice in the time since this was written. This was written August 1949, so this was only about four or 5 months since Shanghai had been taken over. And that marked a big turning point, especially when it comes to this financial stuff. So the price of grain has been going up. He's noting that there's a cotton problem, and he's doing math here, and he's pointing out how cotton is being hoarded into Shanghai by people who have a lot of money there, because whenever they, as I said, when they created their new currency, the people who had money, they still honored that, and that was actually concentrated in the hands of a lot of like just a few people, right? Like a lot of the business people. So these people started hoarding stuff, which was a very real problem for them that they were being directly confronted with. It wasn't just an ideological thing. It was something that was affecting them seriously. Then he's noting about transport of these commodities. And he's talking about how they're being brought into Shanghai. And again, it was creating this situation of scarcity everywhere else. He's going through, and he's noting the problems with monetary problems as well. And the biggest concern is stabilizing prices. And this is where I get the quote from, where he was saying the most important way to stabilize prices is they need a free flow of commodities, and they need to keep the money pegged to the value of those commodities. And he's saying if they're able to do that, things will work out well for them, at least so he hopes. So I'll go back to the presentation now. And so I'm going to give you some specific examples of what they actually had to deal with. So the first situation that happened is called the Silver Yuan battle. So essentially, because silver coins also existed and were floating around in the country, when they launched this new currency in the hopes of being able to kind of solve the problems and actually be able to make their budget and everything like that, people with silver just started essentially trading wherever they could silver for the newly minted RMB, and they were gathering up RMB wherever they could, whoever would give them RMB, and they were using it to buy silver. And because they had so much RMB, which is the new currency, right? They had so much of it because they had a lot of the old currency. They were able to create a situation where by buying up so much silver, it was pushing up the price of silver, which to other people is then devaluing the RMB, right? If you cause the price of silver to look like it's going so high, then if an anchor of value you've always known in your mind is the silver, then to you, it would seem as though the RMB is losing value. And this is it just shows that a lot of these things are they're not as simple as people might think, but at the same time, when you see these actual case studies, it can kind of help explain what's really happening. So in Shanghai, and that's why you can see it on the map, that this little area, this small area, this was where this was taking place. And the problem began to compound, and it got worse. So by June 4th of 1949, it went from 100 RMB being equal to one of the silver coins to 1,100. And then on June 5th, they were trying to find ways to fight this. So they released 100,000 silver yuan that they had to try to push the price of the silver yuan down to protect the RMB. But it was like a drop in the bucket. It didn't have a huge effect. So only then did they eventually realize they needed to take more drastic measures. So that was when, on June 10th, the Shanghai Military Control Committee sent troops to the metals exchange in Shanghai and shut it down. And they arrested the people who were dealing the most heavily in this speculation. And then only after that did they pass the Measures for Management of Gold, Silver, and Foreign Currency Act, which basically outlawed people privately trading silver and gold. So I like that example because it shows these things don't just necessarily pop up arbitrarily, and a lot of people will hold that belief that maybe whatever they were doing was just on a whim. You can see they didn't immediately jump to having a whole lot of control. It was the situations required added control, and with the prices inflating, right? So it was dramatically increasing the price that regular people were having to pay for food or clothing or anything like that. They had to basically do something to help everybody, and that is really in keeping with the spirit of those guys holding the spears, right? They were fighting back on in their small way in their villages, but then at the same time, once they actually won the country, they're carrying forward that same idea that speculation was basically going to completely destroy everything that they had been trying to work for. But just after that, so you would think maybe people who were doing this kind of speculation would have learned a lesson, but the next event took place, and this is the Battle of Rice and Cotton, where essentially people started just buying up massive quantities of rice and cotton. And actually, there's a really good article I can point to, which it provides a nice reference on this. So this is it's a very informative article I had been reading, and it goes into a lot of this stuff. But you can see when they're discussing the Battle of Rice and Cotton right here, and they point out how, and this is they're referring to Chen Yun here, who we were talking about, and how they began moving products from one place to another in order to quell the problems that were arising out of Shanghai. And this was where they came out with a few of their policies. So they were able to solve the issue of the inflation in a relatively short period of time. But they did it by not intervening with military force. In this instance, they actually realized they needed to intervene in the real world with the real economy. So when Chen Yun noticed that the people in Shanghai, the speculators, were mainly hoarding yarn, while in northern China it was mainly grains, he immediately initiated a shipment of 10 million caddies of grain, which was sent northeast to supply Beijing and Tianjin every day. People speculating on it got arrested, but then these measures, increasing the supply and stopping the people who were intentionally hoarding it purely to make a profit, was able to solve the problem. And you can see that before November, right, they didn't really have the necessary concept of controlling and managing commodities the same way they came out of that after. And this was one of their early lessons they learned. But in the end, what they did was successful. The people who had been acquiring commodities in large quantities, they were eventually, just through the ability to increase the supply by buying from peasants in the countryside and dropping it on the market in Shanghai and other places, these people couldn't continue building up more and more of a stockpile of it, and eventually their ability to control things failed. So the takeaway here is that they learned the importance through a very real lesson, where today in certain countries, right, in the West especially, they have so much buffer because of how financialized their economies are, and how there's so many poorer countries out there which will always be happy to sell them one thing or another to make up for real items that they might be short on. When you don't have that, you're forced to confront the reality that physical things are really what the world comes from, and what the world of finance needs to be tied to. One thing they did in banks was they actually pegged the value in banks that people deposited to products, like to the price of the things they knew they'd need to buy. And in a very short period of time, through doing this and this kind of creative management of the economy, they were able to defeat the inflation. And not sure if I added it in, but there was a graph that I was at least looking at. Oh no, I accidentally have the same slide there twice. But there was another thing that was happening at this time.
On October the 1st, 1950, a large crowd filled Tiananmen Square in Beijing. They were celebrating the first anniversary. Dong gave a speech. In it, he stated that the affairs of each country in the world should be administered by the people of that particular country, and the affairs of Asia should be administered by the Asian people and not by the United States. His remarks prompted people across China to take to the streets and voice their opposition to US aggression. But still, China's relative isolation in 1950 meant that the rest of the world remained largely unaware of its people's outrage. In November of that year, China's special representative to the United Nations, Wu Xiuquan, raised the matter in a speech to the Security Council. The Korean Civil War cannot in any way justify or excuse America's armed aggression against Taiwan. Dear delegates, can you imagine Italy having the right to occupy Corsica because of the Spanish Civil War? Can you imagine the United Kingdom having the right to occupy Florida because of the Mexican Civil War? This would be nonsensical and inconceivable. The country was producing, on average, just over a ton of grain and less than 160 kilos of cotton per hectare. Annual steel production was 158,000 tons. Over 80% of the population was illiterate. On June 6, 1950, just 19 days before the outbreak of the Korean War, the Chinese government had launched a new economic plan. Its goal, over a period of 3 years, was to restore the country's economy and finances to their levels in 1936, prior to the full-scale Japanese invasion. China was also in the midst of a reform that would give land free of charge to more than 300 million farmers. In order to speed up the economic recovery and reduce military expenditure, also in June, the Chinese government had announced a major reduction in the army's strength. 1.5 million soldiers were to be demobilized and join the workforce.
全部投入大生产啊，就开始这个马放南山，枪到雨库，都是当兵的呢，都拿起锄头了、镢头大生产。
哎呀，那个地可种了，你就这么说吧，就按那个事故啊，种地也不少啊，不知道种多少，旁地什么人家就是旁地，旁地种地不打钱。
大生产结果呢，土豆都长挺大了，朝鲜战争爆发了。
Life for everyone, from the common soldiers to China's top leaders, was about to be turned on its head.
其实当时还想，能争取一线呢不参战的可能，因为那时候我们国家。
The situation on the battlefield was confirming such fears. Beginning in August, American planes had been repeatedly attacking the China-DPRK border region.
经常有美国飞机越过这个鸭绿江，把炸弹扔到中国方面。
8月27号这一天，从上午10点多到下午2点多，就前前后后大概有13架次进入了中国东北边境领空。 击伤中国的边民21人，打死3人。然后接到29号，美国的飞机又来，所以从这以后就断断续续的不断，这个侵入中国领空。
MacArthur's confidence is entirely understandable. The United States outmatched China in virtually every field. However, the Americans underestimated China's determination to defend its interests. Since the 1840s, China had experienced one humiliation after another at the hands of Western powers. Impoverished and weak, it had suffered many invasions, paid vast sums in reparations, and seen foreign armies march unopposed across its territory. War was nothing new for China. During the 14-year Japanese invasion, the country had fought back from the brink of defeat. In 1938, while living in a cave in Shanxi province, Mao Zedong had written the book On Protracted War. In it, he pointed out that weapons are not the decisive factor in war. It is people, not things, that are decisive. One day in August 1946, during China's Civil War, American journalist Anna Louise Strong interviewed Mao in Yan'an. In his remarks, the Chinese leader famously dismissed reactionaries as paper tigers. He went on to say, "The outcome of a war is decided by the people, not by one or two new types of weapon." In 1950, China was once again facing a battle for survival. But this time, the enemy was a global superpower.
谁不想过一个太平生活，搞经济建设， 都想过好日子嘛。现在敌人硬要我们侵略我们嘛，要把我们要掐死我们中华人民共和国在摇篮里头嘛，我们刚成立嘛。
抗美援朝保家卫国了，要如果咱们再晚出国，到2022了，那就人家说算，人说打你打你，打你打你。
Can you guys hear me again?
Yeah, can hear you now.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. So I showed that for a few reasons. I liked the fact that they had the footage to really recognize kind of what was going on, the land reform as well, and also the mindset that they were really going into the situation with, that they were essentially surrounded. They had this plan where they were trying to build up the economy, right? But at the same time, they were thrust into this situation where they also had to basically take on a war against the most powerful country in the world. So when they found themselves in that situation, obviously it would be very difficult to show economic growth during that period of time. But although I'm saying that it would be hard to show economic growth, you can see that over the period of time, there actually was significant growth. By 1952, total arable land, they had increased it by 10.25%. They had increased grain production by 46.1%. Total GDP in the country was up 67%. And industrial output more than doubled with 140%. So you can see that, in fact, despite all they had to deal with going into a war, which you can tell from what the people had, like even the veterans were saying, they really did feel it was something that if they didn't do it, that would be it. And there's quotes of Douglas MacArthur basically saying that they could keep going right into China. And something else people don't always realize is that they were already bombing the China side. But that area is actually where a significant amount of all their industry happened to be concentrated. So you can see that the bombings of their industry, it was even more than just bombing their land. It was bombing the thing they were staking all of their hope in. Between 1953 and 1957, this is what's known as the first 5-year plan period, and during that period, they only continued to grow. And I wanted to also find for you guys something that I think is really important here, and that's what Mao actually had to say about what they were doing in terms of their strategy of really putting a high degree of importance on commodities. So Mao would read everything he could find, and one thing he was reading here was what Stalin was saying about why the USSR had problems. Now, keep in mind, at this time, 1952, Stalin died right around that time. So this would be something that...
This is incorrect. This is incorrect. Stalin died in 1953, and it's...
Yeah, that time. Yeah, 1952, 1953. I didn't mean the exact...
But it's crucial to understand that once Stalin was killed, the war in Korea was stopped.
Yeah, so here I'm just talking about what Mao was saying regarding what Stalin had done. And the reason I'm specifically bringing it up is, so he was specifically pointing out multiple times here about how the commodities that, and I would encourage anyone, if they want to understand this specific area deeper, to read this. But he's explaining how viewing industry as something apart from commodities and the farmers and the people who are actually growing stuff, that was what he believed was leading to folly. And he also believed that towards the end, Stalin, in Mao's opinion, would not necessarily think things through, because he says in here somewhere that he had it was almost like a high degree of self-importance, where he would feel that because Stalin just kind of believed what he was saying was right, he wasn't actually carrying out any kind of fact finding, which from what Mao says in other writing, basically his number one thing with the work of Marx, and especially dialectical materialism, is really to do with understanding the reality and as it would apply to somebody wanting just having people jump to it and do what they say, because what Mao would believe would be, if you're not actually seeing the reality on the ground, similar to his very first time visiting with the peasants, you're not going to be making the best decisions that you need to be making. So continuing. So another thing that happened during this period, though, was population also increased. So China's population increased from about 450 million all the way up to the time that Mao left. It had practically doubled. It was around, I believe, 900 million. So it went from 550 to 900 during the time Mao was during the time he was in power. Now, this is where the question would come up, and this is what would be maybe confusing to some people watching this. You would think, okay, maybe economic stuff that they were working on during this period, maybe it wasn't so bad. Maybe there was like a lot of things they were dealing with, trying to fight against. But despite that, a lot of people would still think that okay, so a lot of people would be thinking, I thought Mao was against the population, but this article specifically is probably one of my favorite ones for showing how he actually felt about that. This was in 1949, and this was in response to a white paper the U.S. put out whenever the communists took power. And specifically in here, they begin to talk about population. Yeah. So essentially, in the white paper, when it's going into the Chinese history, it says the population of China during the 18th and 19th centuries doubled, thereby creating an unbearable pressure upon the land. The first problem which every Chinese government has had to face is that of feeding this population. So far, none has succeeded. The Kuomintang attempted to solve it by putting many land reform laws on the statute book. Some of these laws have failed, others have been ignored. So then Mao replies to this, and he says, to those Chinese who do not reason clearly, the above sounds plausible. Too many mouths, too little food, hence the revolution. The Kuomintang has failed to solve this problem, and it is unlikely that the Communist Party will be able to solve it either. So far, none has succeeded. And then Mao says, do revolutions always arise from overpopulation? There have been many revolutions in ancient and modern China and abroad. Were they all due to overpopulation? Were China's many revolutions in the past few thousand years due to overpopulation? Was the American Revolution against Britain in 174 years ago also due to overpopulation? Atchison's knowledge of history is nil. He has not even read the American Declaration of Independence. Washington, Jefferson, and others have made revolution against Britain because of the British oppression and exploitation of Americans, and not because of overpopulation in America. And he just goes on, and he's pointing all of the logical flaws out. And this again is something he always advocated, was you actually have to not just take things that would call this and constantly call out people who are being dogmatic. He would always say when people are dogmatic, it's usually for a selfish reason. They're intentionally avoiding maybe exposing the truth to people. But he goes through and he says, in fact, population is the most important thing they have. He says it in here somewhere. So first he says how in the liberated areas in northern and northeastern China, they already solved the land problem and they're already feeding the population. And then he says, of all things in the world, people are the most precious. Under the leadership of the Communist Party, as long as there are people, every kind of miracle can be performed. We are refuters of Acheson's counter-revolutionary theory. We believe that revolution can change everything and that before long, there will arise a new China with a big population and a great wealth of products where life will be abundant and culture will flourish. All pessimistic views are utterly groundless. So you can see that he's really thinking about things just in a completely different way than what people might be led to believe. And when you look actually at the one China or one child policy in China, that was basically implemented the year after he died. Up until then, that was when China had that explosion of population that we see. And then in 1978, he died, and you can basically see the growth actually slowed significantly after that. That was what we were just reading. So another thing is people might think everything he says sounds very whimsical, but it didn't match with reality. But as you can see, after the first 5-year plan, right, up until 1957, things were actually going quite well. So I realized there's no legend on here. The turquoise line, the cyan line, second from the top one is overall GDP. The cyan one is agriculture. And then the green one at the very bottom is manufacturing and industry. So industry and manufacturing are combined together here. So you can see things were actually not, they weren't not progressing. They were actually progressing quite well. When you look on a very large graph, though, it might appear like you have these order of magnitude increases, but it could appear to not be as big of a difference as it actually is. Like it's several fold increases in a lot of this stuff. But something else people don't maybe know is at this point, Mao's position in power changed pretty significantly. So somebody we don't usually hear about, a lot of people hear about Deng Xiaoping. They hear about him as coming into China as the big reformer in 1978 or the 80s, that period of time. And they associate him with the opening up to the West and the boom in China's economy that they say occurred after that. But he actually, at this time, was put in charge of the Secretariat. So the Secretariat is essentially so there's the Central Committee, which is several hundred people, right? They're chosen at these national congresses, right? And the national congresses, they can occur every, I think, 5 years, I believe. Pretty sure 5 years. So when the Central Committee is chosen, they within themselves would elect the Politburo, right? Which is a smaller group of people within that committee, but their role is to just meet more frequently. And then at the very top, you would have the Standing Committee, which is an even smaller group of people who will meet pretty much all the time. The Secretariat was designed to be a group of people, not necessarily whose leadership is paramount, but the Secretariat was designed as more of a bureaucratic grouping of people where they would handle the day-to-day, but that doesn't necessarily mean that their decisions are the top decisions, right? So Deng Xiaoping was not put in charge of the main maybe top power position, but he was put in charge of the actual people that were doing the day-to-day, and they created a new position. So prior Mao had been in charge of the Secretariat too. And then after that, they created the position of General Secretary of the Secretariat. And that literally just means the person who's basically in charge of that bureaucratic daily operations function. Liu Shaoqi was another person. And what's interesting is he was actually already in a high-ranking position, but it was actually decided that he would be replacing Mao. And in 1958, he became the chairman of the People's Republic of China. So Mao retained the title of being head of the Communist Party. An example is you could imagine how, at least in Canada, it's like we'll have the person who's in charge of the Liberal Party, but the person in charge of the Liberal Party isn't Justin Trudeau. It's because that's within the actual party, and it's kind of designed to be maybe more ideological or more strategy based, and it's less about the actual operation of the country on a day-to-day basis. And just to kind of round that off, Deng Xiaoping was advocating for and got what he wanted, which was for Mao Zedong thought, which was put into the Constitution in 1946 to be removed out of the Constitution. Mao Zedong thought was really just basically designed, from what Mao had said, to be the experience that they had gone through in the revolution was supposed to be what you would look to when you were thinking of Mao Zedong thought. And similar to how whenever they talked about Leninism, they more so meant integrating the experiences of the Russian Revolution into what they know to be correct, almost creating a chain of history of things that people have done, not that you're supposed to dogmatically reproduce, but that you're supposed to consider and then consider going forward based on realities that have already been uncovered by actual things people have had to do and either failed at or been successful at. So that actually gets taken out at this time. Now, this is where we get to, people will talk about the Great Leap Forward, and essentially when people try to find stuff that basically would say Mao was quite bad, one of the things they'll go to is they'll say, well, look at the Great Leap Forward, and they say that was all Mao's strategy. He kind of came up with it. He was rallying everyone behind it. But while the rallying part maybe, I guess, could be seen as true to an extent in that he was the chairman of the party, and sometimes he would say encouraging things, he was also saying very pragmatic things as well. And you can see even from Wikipedia, which I found very interesting in researching this, how there's a lot of things that make no sense as soon as you actually know what really happened. And I can show an example of that. So basically, we know that the Eighth Party Congress, that was 1956, and then again in 1958. So we can actually go onto Wikipedia, and if you look here, you would see this put into effect the Great Leap Forward, and it was that's where it was launched from, right? And if we actually look at the Eighth Party Congress documents, we can see that's true, which we're about to do. But the first thing I wanted to show you is, so yes, Mao was again the chairman of the party itself, but it also says here, Eighth Congress, Party technocrats Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping assume higher profiles, and then the new group was elected. But what's funny is it's as if there's been like some historical editing to make it appear that these people were less involved with what happens directly next. Because if you actually look, after officially supporting Mao Zedong in the anti-rightist movement of 1957, Deng acted as general secretary. That part we know is true. Deng and Liu's policies emphasized economics over ideological dogma, an implicit departure from the mass fervor of the Great Leap Forward. But this is, they're talking about 1957 supposedly, but the Great Leap Forward was launched 1956, 1958. And this was when, in 1956, Deng Xiaoping actually went in charge of the secretariat. So they're saying when he got put in charge of the secretariat, he reversed some of the stuff which was implemented at the exact time that he was put in. So that's a little confusing. And they say here they acknowledge here in 1956 he wanted to take Mao Zedong's thought out. So Mao had less power at this time, but you can see how they could cause people to be a little confused when they read this stuff. And again, you look up Liu Shaoqi as well, it admits here that he spoke highly of the Great Leap Forward in May. And he stood with Deng Xiaoping in support of Mao's policies against those who were more critical, such as Chen Yun. But if you read any of this stuff, Chen Yun and Mao were actually on the same page, and they're framing it as though these were Mao's policies. Mao became much less powerful at this time, but they like to just keep bringing you back to Mao's policies. But what's even better and what shows so clearly what was going on is I have the actual receipts from the time. So you can actually see right here. So this was 1956. And this was what Mao wrote. So this would have been right at that time, right, of the 8th Congress. And he says, and he has multiple points in here, and he says, particularly worthy of attention is the fact that in the Soviet Union, certain defects and errors that occurred in the course of their building socialism have lately come to light. Do you want to follow the detours they have made? It was by drawing lessons from their experience that we were able to avoid certain detours in the past. That's what he refers to as Leninism, as looking at the mistakes of the Russian Revolution and not reproducing those. And he's saying there's even more reason for us to do that now. What are the positive factors, internal and external? Internally, the workers and the peasants are the basic force. The middle forces are forces that can be won over. And then he specifically says here, the emphasis in our country's construction is on heavy industry. The production of the means of production must be given priority, that's settled. But it definitely does not follow that the production of the means of subsistence, especially grain, can be neglected. Without enough food and other daily necessities, it would be impossible to provide for the workers in the first place. And then, what sense would it make to talk about developing heavy industry? And then he goes on and he says the prolonged failure of the Soviet Union is in part because of their problems with grain output. They were never able to reach their pre-October Revolution level, which interestingly, I'll add here that in the later years of the Soviet Union, they were actually importing a significant amount of food, including from the United States, which I'm sure some of you guys might know this, but a lot of Americans wouldn't realize that as much of a quarter in some years of American produce or agriculture, I think like of grain, was actually going to the Soviet Union. So in this situation, it's interesting because China wasn't able to trade with the U.S. Soviet Union was. So even then, if they are thinking they can not, I'm not saying they were doing that the whole time, but towards then they were importing grain from the U.S. So basically, they had learned their lesson from the very beginning that really the base of commodities was important. We were talking about that with Stalin, but here he's saying we attach more importance to agriculture and light industry. The problem now facing us is that of continuing to adjust properly the ratio between investment in heavy industry on the one hand and in agriculture and light industry on the other. So when people are saying then that he's being very like zealous and he's like, go, build industry. When you read what he actually said at the conference, that doesn't seem to really match with reality. And he goes through in here, and if anyone watches this back, you'll be able to see the title. And I again recommend taking a look at the whole thing yourselves. But he talks about the coastal base, but then he also says again here, and this is something that's very different from what got implemented in the end of the 70s. Don't only just build industry in a few select coastal regions. It's probably a better idea for you to develop that and bring that inland as well. So this is what he's saying, but of course, we're being told that he's the one who's the ideologue and such. So let's see what some other people were saying then. So let's see what Liu Shaoqi was saying. And we can, because this is the actual report from that National Congress. And we can go look, and Liu Shaoqi was talking. So Mao did the opening remarks here. Then he said, in the 11 years since the 7th Congress, we have in this country, with its great territory, huge population and complex conditions, completed the bourgeoisie democratic revolution and also gained a decisive victory in the socialist revolution, right? But he says here, so far as internal conditions are concerned, our victories are due to the fact that we have relied on the worker-peasant alliance and the working class, and that we have extensively united all forces that can be united. And then here he says, humility helps one to make progress, whereas conceit makes one lag behind. This is a truth we must always bear in mind. Comrades, you and I all believe that the strength of liberated Chinese people is inexhaustible. But then he says here, sorry, so this was what he was saying, right? He was being not particularly zealous, I guess. But when you look at what Liu Shaoqi was saying, he said, in the second half of the last year and the first half of this, our party led the people to win a total and decisive victory in the socialist transformation of agriculture, handicrafts, and capitalist industry and commerce. These two victories have brought about a series of fundamental changes in our country's internal and external relations. Then he says, the task confronting the party now is to build China into a great socialist country as quickly as possible by relying on the hundreds of millions of working people who have been liberated and are now organized by uniting with all forces at home and abroad that can be united with, by turning to full account all conditions that are favorable to us. To fulfill this gigantic task, we should correctly sum up our experience of our past struggles. And in here, I'm not sure exactly where, but there's another place where he mentions industry as well. Maybe I read it already, but there's another place in here where he's mentioning it. But then, in addition to him, if we kind of like look again at what another person, Deng Xiaoping, was saying at this time, again, similar to Liu Shaoqi, that they were already completed the transformation of agriculture, handicrafts, all this stuff, right? We fulfilled our revolutionary task. The task set forth at the 8th National Congress of our party was to bring into play all positive factors and forces in striving to make our country a great industrial socialist country. This will be our task for a long time to come. No one knows how long it will take us to accomplish it, but building up China will be, if not more difficult, at least as difficult as making revolution. As far as development is concerned, our entire party is still learning. We still do not know. No one would say that we are not capable of making revolution now that we have succeeded in it, but we are not sure how well we will do at building up the country. But then he goes through and he starts saying they've had a lot of accomplishments, though. We should recognize that despite the great achievements, industrial and agricultural progress has grown rapidly. A preliminary foundation has been laid for industrial development, and many enterprises have been established. Our country is still poor and backward. It will be a long time to turn from such a poor and backward country as China is into an advanced industrial nation, which at this point, it's like, okay, like that seems kind of reasonable. But then he says what Mao said. So now he's referring back to Mao. And he's saying, Chairman Mao wondered if we could carry out economic development within a period shorter than 20 years. So Mao was saying, this is weird because the way it's written, it makes it sound like Mao was maybe pushing for it, but you can actually see what he says here. He says, within a period shorter than 20 odd years and avoid making major mistakes and suffering serious setbacks. So he's saying, can we do it in like, should we try to do it in that period of time? Wouldn't we then suffer setbacks? And that's what he then kind of clarifies here, because he says, he implies that if we do not proceed cautiously, we may make major mistakes and suffer serious setbacks in development as well. But then he says, it's not without precedent. So should we like listen to Mao? And then he says, is it possible for us to build up our country in a relatively short period of time without making mistakes? I would say yes, because we have the conditions that are favorable. And then he says why the Russians had problems because of circumstances at that time for them, but we will likely not have problems. We're going to be fine, and we should push forward. The industrial and domestic situation is in our favor. What we must do now is take advantage of the situation and accomplish more with less money. But then there's a specific thing in here where he says to like go as fast as possible too. We should pay attention to form wherever possible, but not allow that to like basically slow us down. Yeah, there's a specific line in here somewhere, but I'm not gonna like dig around for it, where again he specifically says like make it faster. But you can even see from a lot of that stuff. Yeah, and he also says that the party leadership was important. So because of that, that will make them successful where maybe other people weren't able to do it. So different from the cautious tone of Mao, mentions the cautious tone and says, no, we like it can be done within 20 years, and we probably won't necessarily have the problems that Mao was asking. Could we have problems if we try to push it so quickly? So that was what we just looked at. So then now we can actually see what happened. So it was going up. And then as soon as that happens, you see that dip on agriculture right there. And what I can actually do, which might look less professional, but while I'm actually in like the slide editor, I can actually show very specifically. So 1949, 1950, 1951, we saw that, right? 1952, 1953, this was up to right around that point where there was that changeover. And as you can see, things are growing fairly uniformly, fairly symmetrically. And then right around this period, you see agriculture start to drop, industry shoots up dramatically, right in this time period where Mao was talking, we were hearing what he was saying about being careful, and maybe other people were being a little bit more saying being careful is not as important, right? And it shoots up. So here you see it shoot up even more. Like that is a very, compared to the speed it was growing at, right? In 2 years, that's a very substantial burst. Like it almost looks unnatural. And then you see something else happen. Following that, suddenly it reverses and becomes more normal looking. So what happened there then? Well, this is where obviously you would hear people say that Mao was crazy with his Great Leap Forward, and that it caused Mao caused people to starve. Well, we saw Mao was really like less powerful now. We read what he was saying about being careful, but then what we can also see now is what really happened. And this is a graph of the industries people worked in China at the time. And you can see that during that period, there's a dramatic decrease in people working in agriculture, and a dramatic increase, like a unnaturally large increase in people working in industry. So when you hear that there was then a food shortage in China, the amount of agricultural output did go down, but in a sense, it's not something that is to be so surprising when you see the dramatic redistribution of people where they were working that occurred. And to say that that was specifically on the one person who had in part retired, like he was retiring in a lot of ways. It seems strange, especially when he was counseling, hey guys, maybe more balance is a better idea, and not to, like, we're not saying industry is not a good thing, but maybe be calm. So it obviously did recover, as we saw, right? And during that period of time where it does make this recovery, you can actually see them putting out more stuff. So Mao's actually talking to people, and this was in 1958. So already, as this is going on, so this is interesting because the mobilization of more people away from the farms, right, was continuing. But he's saying here, the first secretary, which I believe would be talking about Deng Xiaoping, must coordinate with the industrial secretary. The enthusiasm was for over 30 million tons of grain, but 10 million of that is subjectivism. One does not know the difficulties of a thing without experiencing it. So he's in 1958 saying the amounts of grain that you guys are expecting you'll be able to get, it doesn't match with reality. And subjectivism, as I said, he always railed against, was people just assuming because they think something, it's going to be correct and it's going to play out correctly. And he's saying that industry is different. So he's fully understanding the situation. He's saying industry is different from agriculture. In industry, many factors affect one another through their mutual relationships. To develop steel, we must develop coal, electricity, etc. There can be no missing link. In agriculture, there are fewer factors affecting one another. There is three-way alliance between the party, the masses, and the technocrats. And he says experimental fields and high yields constitute a big liberation of mankind and mankind's comprehension of nature, but the three system has broke down many insurance coefficients. It is better to write it in. We must make the time more flexible and do some more revisions. So he's saying basically that there's not enough. This is a measure of land, right? And he's saying that the amount of land being cultivated, it's not enough. And he's talking about solutions that they could go forward and implement as you go through this. But the story and the fact that those individuals who kind of took charge, the fact that they just kind of are usually left out, is very strange. So at this point, going forward, and I think I have in here final graph. Yeah, this one. So you can see that over the course of period of time that Mao was in power, things were growing, and then at that period of time, shoots down, goes back up, and then after the recovery, it basically continues in an upward direction. Now, what's interesting is everything I've mentioned here is also reflected somewhere else. So some of this is Chinese statistics that I'm using, but I find almost the exact same. So these are our CIA reports, and you see here, this is 1971, and they're reporting industrial output rose by 10 to 12%, substantial gains in steel, petroleum, and other basic industrial products, striking advances, missiles, jet aircraft. Agriculture continued to benefit from increased outputs of fertilizer and equipment from the industrial sector. It said foreign trade continued to be a source of advanced equipment and technology at the leading edge of China's industrialization drive. So when I read that, I thought that was strange, because I had thought that like they were, because of the balance of payments condition, and also the fact that the US hadn't opened up to trade with them, I didn't recognize that there was actually significant progress that they were making through this time period. And if you actually look at the specific economic statistics, which I have in here too. So this is actually a really good breakdown of everything that the CIA knew about China's economic performance the whole time. And you can see that while GDP was increasing right down here, right up to when the US first officially normalized relations with China in 1972, we can see that there was very, very, very few, if any, there was just maybe in 1950 and then none, US exports to China, but they did have considerable trade. You see here with communist countries, but even beyond that, they were trading with most of the free world. And you can also see agricultural production again increasing. But of course, during this period of time, right, this 1958 to 1960 period, it went down. But after that, after the recovery, and then I'll add that it was during the period of this recovery that the individuals, right, like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, they were kicked out. And when you hear the story of Deng Xiaoping, you always hear that he was kind of kicked away, and they make it seem like maybe it was just for no reason. But I think from what we've seen, these people seem to be much more on board with the programs which led to problems at that point. But you can see the increase in the grain production. You can see what's interesting, cotton doesn't increase as much, but they decided around this period to start importing cotton because they could use the cotton to output. And in the Chen Yun papers, he mentions, he compares it to Great Britain, how they would do that. And he's like, that's not a bad idea. Let's import cotton ourselves to increase our capacity if we can put out more cotton products. And if you even think, one of the earliest things people imagine coming from some of these Asian countries is like T-shirts and stuff like that. That was one of the more early things. Industrial production, again, was increasing. And all of this was under that constraint of maintaining that strict balance. Now you see, at the time that they opened up with the US and they initiated trading, you can see that the level, so that's 690 million, 819 million. So huge amounts of money started flowing in. So of course, that shows some, that obviously shows an effect on their economy. But a significant amount of that was flowing into the service sector as well. So the basic premise here is that they were actually making gains the entire time. And I have one final little point to hit on, which is in this CIA document they put out, which is Chinese economic gains in 1971, again, before they opened up to the US. They say, since the waning of the Cultural Revolution in 1969, the PRC has enjoyed 2 years of modernization in economic policy and of rapid advance in national output. As Premier Chou En-lai, who had been a prominent figure in the party this entire time, and he was known for being really close with Mao, explained in a speech, an extraordinary rise in industrial production of about 17% was achieved as new productive capacity constructed during the chaotic days of the Cultural Revolution came into full use. So when I was reading that, I was thinking, we're supposed to have always heard that the Cultural Revolution was like a very negative event, and I think this is probably actually one of the things to me that was the most surprising to find out of all. And essentially, we see this, and I got confused whenever I ran across that as well. So I started looking to try to understand more about what was actually going on at that period. So right here, it's talking about the Cultural Revolution, what's going on, and it's saying, Mao believed that in the past, Liu Shaoqi and others distorted and emasculated educational reforms designed to create the new Chinese man. This belief of Mao's, to some extent, is true, led Mao to launch a wholesale assault on the educational system as part of the Cultural Revolution. And the more I was reading into it, the more I was finding that they really point to changes in education as being probably the number one like stuff to do with schools. So students being chaotic. The Red Guards started out as students in Beijing. It's a lot of it actually centered around educational related stuff. So it says the nullification of educational system is a deliberate political act demonstrating one of Mao's most immutable values. It says, Mao's long-standing distrust of the intellectual is based on the realization that when the core of Chinese intelligentsia was educated in the West, thus they are a product of a bourgeois society, and graduates since 1949, the product of an educational system dominated by bourgeois intellectuals and therefore probably contaminated by non-proletarian ideology. And then somewhere here, it says, I believe it's in here, or it might be, because I have a couple of these documents, but there's one where it specifically says, I was showing Matt this before, that him thinking that it says he's not entirely wrong, that they're being subversive. So to understand that, I was digging into where the education system in China actually got its funding from. And then this was what was really shocking, is this is a paper from the British from 1923, where they were basically deciding that they were going to redistribute a large portion of the funds they were already collecting anyways from the customs service. And this was after the Boxer Anti-Foreign Rising, to essentially inspire students in the country to think a certain way. And in here, they're actually directly saying that a series of Western books carefully adapted to influence the scholars who, in a degree not realized by the West, have remained the leaders of Chinese thought and action. And this is the proposal document where they're basically saying we should be putting our money into funding that stuff as well. And they're actually just straight up admitting here, because this is before they've done it, so they're actually just painting the case. And they're saying they want to denationalize them, but furthermore, they say that it would pay dividends for time to come if they're able to entrust China to liberal minds. So, in reading into this, what I realized was there was a whole other movement, which, if you understand this movement, then, and you understand the Cultural Revolution in light of this movement, then things make a lot more sense. So this is called the New Culture movement. And essentially, if you look at the major positions, and this is where I think it's really important to also recognize something, which I'm actually going to. So it's really common today for people to talk about the Chinese Cultural Revolution, and basically say that the Cultural Revolution in China is a lesson for us today, because the things that they were pushing are just like what woke, destructive leftists are pushing today. But and so I'm just bringing this up, and they're saying it was like an early and extreme version of cancel culture, right? And I'm sure a lot of you guys have heard this narrative. I know I had heard it as being similar to today. Paranoid Mao loosed the Red Guards on his party enemies, including Liu Shaoqi. Liu Shaoqi being the guy that we talked about who organized the first thing. So Liu Shaoqi, we saw in the CIA document, was in charge of education system. So the education system, which was dominated by people who got a very certain education. And when you read about the New Culture movement, this is actually far more similar to what people will talk about today. It says this was the progressivist movement, and in it, they were promoting an end to the patriarchal family in favor of individual freedom and women's liberation. Around this time, I can't remember her name. She's from the West. She went to China and started doing lectures on birth control. They're also saying that China should do away with Confucianism. Now, this is something people say, well, oh, that's what Mao wanted during the Cultural Revolution. But as you can see, that was actually what was being talked about at this time. They were actually saying we should criticize all old texts. And the way to study them now is not to try to learn lessons from them. We should just analyze their content in a purely physical way. Like, we should be like, how old are these pages, and was this really written by this person? Almost looking at them not for the information they contain, but as artifacts, just physical items. Democratic and egalitarian views, and specifically Chen Dushi, the guy who Mao kicked out, right, when this guy didn't want to help with the peasants. This was one of the scholars, and this was all centered around Beijing University, Peking University. He was one of the scholars who was actually on board with this whole new culture movement, but he specifically says in the New Youth Journal that they need to embrace Mr. Science and Mr. Democracy, and these were symbols of that, right? But what's interesting is even Bertrand Russell at this time. So Dewey was probably the most visible person in doing this. His book on democracy and education was essentially spelling out how in China they wanted, or well, this was for everywhere, but it was basically on changing education systems so people are all individuals. I can just probably find it. So Dewey was brought into China to lecture to these students at these schools. Now, these students in the schools themselves were also being funded by the foreign money that we were talking about, and there's actual like more direct proof. Scholarship. So there's actually even pages for this, and you'll find a lot of these people, right? These students who were in these positions, they were actually studying on the scholarship fund by the foreign powers, which they had specifically said they were implementing in the guise of causing people to become more liberalized, but at the same time to defeat the nationalistic impulses that might be growing. So understanding that the original founder in early 1920s, 1921, Chen Dushi, was actually a part of this movement, which was all centered around Peking University, it makes a lot of sense. So this is Dewey, but there was also Bertrand Russell who went to China, and he was lecturing at that time as well. And interestingly, Mao actually replied to Bertrand Russell. I feel like these days it's hard to find. So I've read a lot of these in the preparation for doing this. So there's no way I could go over all of it. So if you guys have any other like questions, just when I wrap up, you can ask those as well. But in this, he directly says in his lecture, Russell took a position in favor of communism, but against the dictatorship of the workers and peasants. In other words, advocating for everyone just having a free mind and free to do whatever, but under no centralized authority, right? Which, as we clearly saw, especially in the first lecture too, the lack causing so many problems spoon-fed to them were all solutions which were seeming to not lead to success for them. Well, here Mao says, right from the beginning, 1921, my objections to Russell's viewpoint can be stated in a few words. This is all well in theory, but unfeasible in practice. Education requires money, people, and instruments. In today's world, money is entirely in the hands of the capitalists, which in China, the way it was for him, that was completely true. And it's clear that it was those people who we saw inflating the currency to the point where the price of 2 cows was a sliver of a piece of rice. So all of this was actually the experience at that time. He says, those who have charge of education are all either capitalists or wives of capitalists. In today's world, the schools and the press, the two most important instruments of education, are entirely under capitalist control, which we've literally seen that they were actually all funded by these countries, which they openly admitted was in an effort to create this subversion. And again, with all of these, I recommend reading them because it's very difficult without it taking a long time for me to read out like every word that they say. But this is another one of the good ones that I would definitely recommend. Trying to think, because I feel like there was the one last thing to mention about. So a few like more fast points is when it comes to the Red Guards, which people would have heard about. It turned out that when they started arising, they were mainly actually in Beijing, centered around the universities, and they were children of high-ranking party officials at first, who were actually going around and harassing other party officials themselves. So it was almost like there was a power play taking place. There was a group of people in it who were also, and like Lin Biao was one of them, who were basically accused of overhyping Mao's image. So a lot of those Red Guard rallies, Mao wasn't at them. He got invited to come to them, but these people were promoting the idea of Maoism. There's an actual quote from Mao where he specifically said that he didn't like the word Maoism. He said that it made no sense. Like he said that he liked the idea of people understanding Mao Zedong thought if they want to understand something specific he said. But again, he always was railing on when people would have like dogmatic views. And then just to go back for a second to the New Culture movement, which literally sits here against traditional values. It also led to some other things. You can see that they were promoting free love as well as anarchism. They wanted to replace the sexuality of traditional Chinese idea with newly emerging individualistic theories. So when you understand these school systems were run by these people, and you understand that this was all the stuff that they were pushing, whenever Mao was frustrated that his educational reforms weren't being implemented, a lot of them were actually to do with battling this exact kind of activity. Because he said that having a bunch of people who spend all their time in classrooms, that doesn't actually benefit the people on the ground. So this site was where I did a lot of my research, and it's like you can come up with a scientist's name or something like that, something that you would think that that someone like Mao would be completely uninterested in talking about. And here he's specifically saying how they need to reform the education. So whenever he was upset that his reforms were like the people in charge seemed to be intentionally not implementing them, He said, "We must reform arts faculties in universities. The students must go down and engage in industry, agriculture, and commerce. The engineering and science departments are different. They have factories for practical work and laboratories. They can work in the factories and do experiments." His whole idea, and people have heard about this, of him wanting students to go down and live with the peasants. It wasn't, keep in mind, that was like 85% of the country was the peasants. So it's a bit condescending to say that that would be the worst thing that could possibly happen when you are in like you would be the most lucky person in the whole country if you were actually, because they made the highest amount of money, like people who went to the highest level of education. Everyone didn't get an equal salary. There's a whole tables, and anyone can look up them, where it was those people who made the most money. But the idea was he wanted them to focus on finding real solutions, not to sit in a classroom, not just all day, but some people would be there just permanently, right? Like they would become a part of the faculty, and they would discuss matters, but never actually go out and try to actually solve the real problems that were facing people. And this was a carryover, as I mentioned before, of that older scholar bureaucrat kind of mindset that you saw those students in the beginning they would love to fall into that role. But this was something that he was obviously realizing that kind of nepotism and just inefficiency was not going to be good. So you can see here, he says they can do this kind of work for a few years and then study for 2 years. This will be enough. If university has a 5-year system, they should go down. And then he also says stuff that teachers can, if you're just learning philosophy, teachers can teach philosophy down in those places too. Like maybe you'll have some good ideas, is what I gathered from that. He says, must they have big foreign style buildings to teach in? He says many great inventors, such as Watt and Edison, came from workers' families. Franklin, who discovered electricity, sold newspapers. He started as a newspaper boy. Many of the great scholars and scientists did not go through college. Not many of the comrades in the Party Central Committee are university graduates. And there was another thing I was reading from him where he was actually saying, were there many people who made great discoveries who were just career students? He's not saying no one should get an education. He above all wants people to be educated. That was why under him there was a mass movement to make everybody literate, which is actually, and in understanding the Cultural Revolution, the most important thing and the most important work, which I found by far, and this was really something that just made everything make so much more sense to me, was this book. And this was written by somebody who grew up in one of these villages. He's a professor. And he says that during the educational reforms, his village set up a primary school. So this was during the Cultural Revolution, and hired its own teachers. And that was the first time they had that. Every child in the village could go to the village school for free. So it was like a free education system, basically. And he says here, about 70% of students went there. But this is the most interesting of all. So he says, in 1986, while teaching at Tsinghua University, I was involved in a research project in rural Henan with a group of American historians and political scientists. The presence of foreigners in a rural village attracted a big crowd of children of different ages. Out of curiosity, I asked some of the children to read some newspaper headlines. One after another, they shook their heads. I thought that they were simply shy, but other children explained that they were not in school. To my dismay, it was the same story everywhere that we went. I talked with people about why this happened. They told me that since the collectives were broken up and land was divided among individual households, village schools were no longer free of charge. And this was what happened directly after Mao died. At the same time, they put in the one-child policy and that other stuff. He says, some families could not afford to send their children to school. Others needed children home to help in the fields. Girls were among the first to be sacrificed as they were assigned to household chores. So he says the rural children's loss of educational opportunities shocked me and forced me to think. the government attributed the lack of educational opportunities to the poverty of the Chinese rural areas. However, I reached a different conclusion. It was not poverty that deprived the rural children of educational opportunities. Poverty is only relative. Why were the children of the villagers able to finish high school during the Cultural Revolution? China's rural areas were poorer then than now. And then he says, cautiously and skeptically, I began to appreciate the significance of the rural educational reforms during the Cultural Revolution, which really, the more and more I find, is the Cultural Revolution was really mainly surrounding, if you look at what came from Mao, it was surrounding education. If you look at what was coming from other people, yes, you have some people who were trying to stoke up, like Lin Biao, who were trying to stoke up fervor for their own benefit. But even Lin Biao himself actually got called out by Mao eventually and gotten rid of. And interestingly, and he has tables in here where he's showing all of the different changes that occurred in the villages. And the biggest point he makes is that, and this has been the story basically the entire time we've gone through all of this and understood all of this, is that really, unless you're understanding what's going on with the 80% of people, and you're just only really hearing the stories from the few people in schools, right? Like a lot of the stories of the Cultural Revolution is all like Red Guards, but when you actually look into it, those were all running around basically in the major cities for the most part. There was a movement later on where some of those students in the very early days, who were basically have been openly said to have been mainly children's of parent or of party members, some of them wrote Mao and said, hey, do you like our posters? And when he replied to that, what ended up happening was a lot of people all over the country wanted to join, but then these people were just genuine people who didn't carry out any of the more, like when you hear the stories of Red Guards, like beating up people, it was all mainly centered around that stuff happening in those big cities where it was power politics largely. And here, this was the part, was one of the issues, right? Was leaders in the villages were kind of falling back into the more, because China had been feudal for 2,000 years. And a lot of the officials, the people who were put in charge of these villages, they started just behaving like how the leaders had always behaved in these villages. And Mao was obviously concerned that this would cause everything to just kind of go back to how it used to be. So in the experience of these people in the villages, the criticizing Confucius campaign, which was one of the very last things he did, it wasn't criticizing all of Confucius. It says here, the campaign to criticize Lin Biao and Confucius, carried out in 1973 and 1974, was a good illustration of this. What had Lin Biao or Confucius to do with the common villagers? Why should common farmers be concerned with the power struggles among top leaders, right? Which is what we're always just told about stuff happening in the cities. Or what an ancient philosopher said. For thousands of years, Chinese villagers lived very apolitical lives. And we kind of saw that, right? Like we saw that they weren't even literate. For thousands of years, lived apolitical lives, seldom getting involved in politics. The fact that Mao and other cultural revolution leaders saw the need to involve common villagers, most of whom were illiterate, which that was then what was being changed as well, right? And were considered ignorant by the elite, was in itself revolutionary and democratic. According to some villagers, rural people were thought of by urban people as laonyai, dumb and senseless. They supposedly refused to be provoked even if they were kicked. But a central point of the campaign to criticize Lin Biao and Confucius was that rural people were not stupid. It was a completely different kind of politics that empowered farmers. To many of the educated elites, the anti-Lin Biao and anti-Confucius campaigns seemed vague and abstract, which is exactly what we see in the West, where people they'll be like, why was he trying to destroy Confucius? Like, he did not want traditional Chinese culture. Well, if anything, that was the group prior, right? Those actually Western influenced people who wanted to be the new elite. But in fact, it made a lot more sense if you were just a common peasant. And it says the major theme of the campaign was to criticize the elitist mentality. It denounced Confucian philosophy, and you can actually read the specific posters in the villages. And it wasn't the best things Confucius said. It was things he said which were designed to preserve the power structure, where if you were on the lower end of the totem pole, you should know your place and you shouldn't criticize the person above you. Well, you don't necessarily want that in a government, like, especially if you're trying to kind of turn over a new leaf. You want people to feel their opinion is valid, they can speak up, they're not stupid just because of where they were born. At the same time, of course, you don't want them to behave like toxically to society, but you don't want people to be toxic to them either. And it says the Confucian philosophy specifically, which I'm not going to try to read that in English. It is a general rule that the elite are respectable and that ordinary people are stupid. It promoted Mao's idea that the masses are the motive force of history and that the elite are sometimes stupid, while the working people are intelligent, because they actually are the ones who are obviously responsible for any wealth that goes to anywhere else in the country, which, I mean, that does make sense. These were not empty words. The villagers toiled all year round, supplying the elites with grain, meat, and vegetables, but they were made to feel stupid in front of the elite. They did not know how to talk to the elite and accepted the stigma of stupidity that the elite gave them. In the eyes of the Chinese elite, farming was a lowly occupation. The campaign encouraged the rural people to straighten up their backs and help them to recognize their own worth. In this sense, the campaign served to help common Chinese villagers discover their dignity. Some said that they began to walk a little different and see it with a different perspective. Farming was hard but important. Other people have no right to look down on them because they could not survive without their toil. So if you read these things, it shows how we're prone to be getting the picture of the city. So anytime you hear anything that's going on, and especially in this historical stuff, because now obviously the picture has changed even more, and the number of people involved in farming has gone down and people's incomes have gone up. But in these times, a lot of the stuff where it really centered around big mass movements and stuff like that, those were really movements being followed by the big majority of people, not the tiny little fraction at the top. That I can probably end it there. I see that we're right around the 3-hour mark. Mm-hmm. So if anyone has any specific or particular questions, I suppose, if we have time for that, I'm not sure. There was more stuff that I know on this topic. It's just I kind of had to make sure that I fit as much as I could in, but especially I know some of this stuff is going to be controversial. So if anyone knows of anything they want to criticize me on or question me on, or you think I maybe didn't read a certain thing, then again, welcome to that. But my basic conclusion is that Mao was he seemed to have actually been on the right side of what was going on, and it sounds controversial to say, but like I think unless I see something new, I'm pretty much standing behind that at this point. Although it's a pretty surprising thing that I never thought that I would say, but this is just what I found from actually doing the research.
No, thank you very much. And it's definitely something I've encountered quite a bit as a dysfunction in the society we live in, where you look at the way our university systems are wired, and it generally produces people who are trained to live in an ivory tower, live in an abstract world, but not really, especially within the type of consumer cosmopolitan so-called democratic society that we're expected to adapt to, of this post-industrial ideas-based fourth industrial revolution. People are supposed to live through a world where they have these abstract ideas, but that don't really have any useful skills as far as reality. But then if you want to have useful skills, we can go to trade school and learn a trade relatively quickly, which in my mind is still much, much, much healthier. But then you have this other dysfunction to the other extreme where you don't learn really any of the philosophical or metaphysical ideas needed to give you a sense of the deeper causes into things behind the surface appearance of technique. So that does create like a bit of a dysfunction, although those who have real world skills, as Socrates pointed out in his many dialogues, actually do have real knowledge because they've worked on their trade and mastered a real skill. So when they speak about those things, they speak with real knowledge and not sophistry or the appearance of knowledge. So I think this new culture movement that you brought up is very interesting as well as a lead to follow up on. The fallacy of both the Dewey and the Bertrand Russell schools influencing the educational paradigm. That's very interesting as well. There's a lot of things you've opened up here that I think are really worthwhile. But for me, the objective criteria of the increased productivity and the increased associated quality of life.
Can you see this video still, or is my screen still showing?
Are you there?
Yeah. Yeah, you can see this?
I can see a video, yeah.
Yeah, so it's like there's no sound necessary. But you saw those people towing that boat, right? Like today, they have tugboats they built and they're towing the largest new ship in the world. It broke the record for the largest ship. And this is the same river that 80 years ago, those people were towing that boat along the side. So it's like there's something there that is so obvious that how can you believe that it was a terrible foundation that it was all built on, right? Like there is something there that if you really step back, it's like it seems strange to think, right?
Yeah. Well, let's open up for a few questions. We only have a little bit of time though, so I'd say if anybody has any pressing thought or criticism or question or anything, now would be the time to launch it. And we only have a few minutes though. I see Harinder. Yeah, Harinder. Okay, yeah. But in the future, just put your name down in the chat area, so I'll call upon you that way.
Thanks. Hi, Kangzheng.
Hey.
You finished with your conclusion that you thought Mao was on the right side of many things, and I think the reason he has been vilified, I would say, in the Western media is because he represented the revolution against foreign, imperialist control of China, right? And that control is still being attempted by Taiwan right down to this day. But so anybody who's taking a step against the globalists, the global capitalists, who possibly at the time through the British Empire, would be subjected to this kind of unfair vilification. But also, I want to I'll leave that thought with you to respond to. But also, I think when countries like the Soviet Union or today Russia and China are being targeted for destabilization by foreign interests, a certain amount of totalitarianism inevitably sets in as a defensive measure. It's just my thought, and I'd like your opinion on that. For instance, if today the CCP, which is portrayed as an authoritarian regime, were to suddenly switch to democracy, wouldn't they open themselves up to a great deal more destabilization by the CIA, etc.? I'll just leave. Those are the questions and thoughts I have. If you have anything to respond to that.
Good observations.
Yeah, no, I totally see. And so what was even stranger to me was at the end, I was when I realized some other things, like the fact that under Deng Xiaoping, China brought in a CIA base that they set up inside China. And when he had his first visit to the US, he saw it was recently declassified that Deng Xiaoping was brought to the CIA headquarters, and then he later approved that base being built, supposedly to spy on Russia, but the US had stuff going on already in there, so it's almost like it was just as much against them, and it did make me honestly like, I don't believe that. If anything, I used to believe more like China had a pretty positive upward trend, and if anything, the beginning was the part where it was more shaky. And it's like, if anything, looking at like the inflation, the people who suddenly weren't being taught how to read anymore, if anything, I think there was a very shaky period up until very recently with Xi Jinping, and I think that whenever the students were going to work in the villages, right, he was one of those students. And my personal theory is maybe he saw the way that because they loved Mao, like the villagers absolutely loved him, and you can see that everywhere. People I know, their families kind of say the same thing, and he would have seen the power that gave Mao to have the people like him. And I think that I'm not saying it's I'm not even saying it's like an ulterior motive and he's doing it not malicious, like Machiavellian, like he might actually have been inspired by that. But either way, you can see that he takes a much stronger interest in like the poorer people than maybe what I've seen with past leaders. He's always going to the villages, and I think he was inspired by that. So in the sense that I don't think that they're going to hurt people with the current government they have in power right now, and I really do think they have their interests at heart. I believe that to be true. Who knows if a new government was to take power? Like, these things can always change. Like, history is not static. And at the same time, it also makes me realize that things weren't so good 20 years ago, despite the balance sheet appearing good. Of course, if you import a ton of stuff, that's exactly what the US found out as well. Like in right, whenever they started building up their huge deficit, things look good for a while, but you're hollowing yourself out. So that's basically my thoughts on that.
China was recruited by Nixon and Kissinger to be a slave labor economy, and the CCP or CPC, I'm not sure how it's called, managed to raise, so I read, 700 million people out of extreme poverty, while also developing advanced industry, which is the reason they are now being portrayed as a threat to America. So they have done an extraordinary accomplishment at the same time that in the West, the middle class has been devastated, and even further steps are being taken to depopulate. But whereas in China, it would seem that the party actually tried to help the people, raise them from poverty, and develop the country technologically. So those are phenomenal accomplishments.
Yeah, and also though, like I would add too, like it's not only one-sided in the sense that you can just as much see Sir Henry Kissinger bringing Nixon to China, but that harms the U.S. too, right? Because ever since the end of World War II with Bretton Woods, their whole problem with the U.S. was that the U.S. was this manufacturing power. So what do? The first thing is you don't want them to turn their industry into producing things, right? Like a value, right? So people, like you can kind of see, it's like the British brought the US really into the Cold War, so then that way they don't turn their manufacturing into actually making productive products, things that will then build on themselves, like what Mao said, industries outputs are the inputs to more industry that right? But no, they wanted them to just rechannel it onto weapons. But the most interesting thing is in the 1945-46, the Employment Act passed. That was based on Keynes's theories. Keynes had just been negotiating with the US to get them on that balance of payments, but then with this deal, right, with the Employment Act, it mandated the president's job is to make sure that they have close to full employment. But of course, if you're basically saying, okay, guys, you always have to have like close to full employment and create jobs in the government or wherever in order to achieve that, print money if you have to. Well, yeah, the US had all the gold. They wanted to get the gold out. They had to put downward pressure on the currency. How do you do that? You get them to have to print money to make sure everyone's employed, because that's now the new number one concern, according to Keynes. But you're also locked in that world system that, again, he was an architect of, and that's why it's like you get him, he's Lord John Maynard Keynes, not just Sir. They reserve the Lord for like when you really come up with something like that and pretty much nuke a superpower. So I bring that up just to say, with them opening up, that was basically around the time that had succeeded. 30 years was all it took for the US to no longer be able to peg to gold at all, right? And then with that, it's kind of like China would supply them with the produced goods, right? But just as much, that prevents the US from making any reverse progress on maybe reindustrializing or focusing on the more productive aspects of industry. So I do think that like to be fair to the entity that is the US, it wasn't only against China making them a slave state, it was just as much also hurting the US too. And that's me showing that I'm a balanced person. And when I come to this conclusion about Mao, it's only from everything I found.
Thank you. I'm sure some other people have questions at this the great long discussion, but I've taken enough time. Thanks so much.
Marilyn.
Yes, I just have a brief comment. First, thank you so much for this presentation. It was really fascinating. And I wanted to just especially express my appreciation that you brought up the book, The Unknown Cultural Revolution by Dong Ping Han, which I have right here. At a local community radio station here in Berkeley, California, a woman used to have a program that challenged a lot of official narratives, and she interviewed Dong Ping Han about 10 years ago. And I was so fascinated by that program. I went back and listened to it again. I bought the book, I read it. And since then, I've mentioned it to several people, including some Chinese friends of mine, and they all say, oh, no, that can't be true. The Cultural Revolution was all bad. It was all terrible and violent and all of this stuff. So I'm just so glad to hear you talk about that as part of your presentation and validate, what is said in that book and tell us that no, that wasn't an anomaly. There were actually a lot of positive aspects about how it, uplifted and empowered people in the countryside and brought education to the rural villages. So again, thank you for that.
No problem. And yeah, out of all the Chinese ethnicity overseas, it's only 1% to 2%. And then the people you're going to encounter, it's going to be people who would have had some kind of money likely if they left, even if it wasn't a ton. So I was my partner, her family, I was asking them, and I was asking her grandma about this stuff, and they were like they were saying, like the grandma was originally saying, oh, it wasn't so good, but then the aunt was saying like, oh, well, that's kind of because of the fact that he did own, like her grandfather did, his family had a good amount of land. So like he wasn't so happy about that specific period of time with the land reform and whatnot. But other people in the family, they had a really different opinion. But I had to bring it out of them. Like I had to be like, oh, what about uncle's family? And they're like, oh, actually, they were really poor. Like for them, it was good. But they just glossed that over like kind of easily, when it's like, you have to recognize that the majority of the people were actually the people in the, oh, it was good. They got something out of it. They weren't the feudal landlord, or even just the person who had accumulated a large amount of land. Even if they worked hard for it, it's still, they are just a small number. And I always say it's similar to the American Revolution. There were hundreds of thousands of loyalists who lost everything, and New York had laws on the books for decades to take away their houses, and you could even just be accused of being a loyalist and have your stuff taken. So it was, if anything, I think it was less organized there, because the party really relied heavily on lots of democracy. Like you see that so often. That's how Mao was basically so hamstrung, right? Like the democracy that he created worked against him. It was actually under Deng Xiaoping that he created a council of elders, which subverted a lot of the Central Committee's voting authority and put power in the hands of a group of people where, in order to get in, you had to have been in the party for more than 40 years. And I'm not saying 100% Deng Xiaoping is the worst of the worst, because I think that he did stop the 1989 event from transpiring. So I think maybe he was duped or something, or maybe he didn't realize what the full plan was. Maybe he thought he'd just be in the cool kids club. I'm not completely sure. But yeah, that's my little response to that.
Well, I definitely appreciated some of the remarks that you cited from Mao, especially on his refutation of Malthus, and I guess that was in response to Dean Acheson's remarks that had to do with the assumption that revolution is the effect of overpopulation, and he's like, well, was the American Revolution simply, did that occur by overpopulation as a response? And then he cites and speaks so highly of the founding fathers and George Washington. And in other places, he recognizes the power of Benjamin Franklin as somebody who was not a product of any university system, but just had a authentic love of discovery and freedom, that he was able to generate his revolutionary discoveries himself. So I love that there's this degree of sophistication in his analysis of the ideas that gave rise to great revolutions. That was really good. That was really surprising that he had that level of depth, especially in opposition to Malthus. So that was cool.
Yeah, and I think people need to understand, like with the whole Marxism thing, it was that, and he's talked about this, it's like everyone had all these isms, right? But he's like, this is the only ism that, because it's like they were looking for something. They needed something to make them, because they didn't want to do what China had done before. They knew that wasn't working. And he was like, using Marxism is the only thing where it's designed to be used by normal people. And when you really look at what Mao said about it, you have to think of it in the exact same lens of what I said about the people in the villages. It's like, what does the Confucius thing mean to them? And it's like, it's actually a much more simple thing. Like with dialectical materialism, his conception of it, the way he explains it to the soldiers to use, is he's saying, like, don't base things on subjective ideas about what reality is. Actually test your ideas. And when you look at something, right, recognize the contradictions in it. Like if you say, Chiang Kai-shek is a really bad guy, this was one of his quotes. He's like, yeah, but recognize that there's some people to whom he smells like a fragrant flower. And he's saying those people would be like certain people in America and certain imperialists. And he's like, you have to dig into things. Like you have to look back and forth and really dig down to get to the truth. There was a great quote he had where he was talking about the solar system. And he was like, and these are the actual kind of conversations he had just sitting around with people. And it's amazing how like such a significant portion of them are all recorded. And this was a really fascinating one. I don't know if my screen is still sharing, but he's having this conversation where he's saying, oh, you can take away a half of a hammer for every single day and the hammer will never actually be gone, because there'll always be a little piece of it left. But he's relating this to these concepts. He says the world is infinite in both time and space. The world is boundless and inexhaustible. Beyond our solar system are numerous stars which together from the Milky Way. Beyond the galaxy are numerous other galaxies. And he would bring in people to like update him on the newest science. And he was saying that he was talking about Newton, and he was saying everything in the world is changing. Physics is changing. Newton's laws of physics are changing. And then he would say then that means they're not laws, right? He's trying to tell people these laws you're taught in school aren't always a law. The world has evolved from one in which there was no Newtonian theory to one which there was, and therefore from Newton's theory to the theory of relativity. This is dialectics. He's saying to people that you should always be trying to find the truth in the real world and don't just believe what you've been told, because his whole life, the people who were trying to make the change were being told stuff by people that was leading to their own folly, right?
Jerry, you have a question? And I think this is going to have to be our final question for tonight, unfortunately.
Okay, can you hear me all right?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. I just want to thank you very much for your presentation on Mao. sort of a rehabilitation for those of us who had been brainwashed into disliking him. And the thing for me that really changed my mind about Mao was when I read his poetry. Well, actually, when I got a decent translation of his poetry. But, you know, I don't know if anyone can imagine any leaders in the West writing poetry. I can't even imagine them reading poetry. It's just so opposite. But I was just wanted to know if you'd actually done any work in reading any of Mao's poetry and what you thought of it.
I didn't read any of that's a lot. I read one poem he wrote about his wife before she got her head cut off, because I read the poem to my friend and I'm like, oh, isn't that a nice poem? And then my friend was like, yeah. And I'm like, yeah, he wrote that about the wife whose head got cut off by the person that you support. Because I was trying to prove a point that like there's more going on here than what some people are brainwashed to think. But the other thing that you totally reminded me of is the Long March is a similar thing. Like, can you imagine a lot of the leaders walking, starting out with a group of like 50,000 people and whittling it down to just when it was a couple thousand, walking across the whole country, not even in a direct line, in a roundabout way, because they're being shot at. It's like, you're only doing that if you're being inspired by something that's beyond just self-interest. You're doing it because you're trying to create something or make a change or do something. But that was not the path that you would take if you were just trying to find the quick route to the top, right? So I can't imagine Biden walking across the US just for the opportunity to try to lead it to a better future.
Yeah, Mao definitely could not have been accused of being a sunshine patriot, as Thomas Paine mocked those who were only revolutionary when the sun was out and things were good. That's for sure. And I'd forgot entirely about his wife, and that she was killed by Chiang Kai-shek. Is that?
Well, it's his troops. Yeah, they killed tens of thousands of communists in different places. But what's interesting is, of course, I'm sure there were soldiers in the communist army who overstepped and did bad things. Their general policy was to always accept the nationalist soldiers to join, because at the end of the day, most of the nationalists were just working for Chiang Kai-shek for money, pretty much, right? Like they weren't ideologically, but yeah, there's so many. I tried to go lower on like the emotional porn of just being like, oh, they did this terrible thing, they did that terrible thing. But yeah, one of them was so many people got killed when they went to Taiwan. Though you can look up the whole Wikipedia article on the White Terror, where they basically killed anyone they thought could question their authority. But yeah, Mao's first wife got killed, and then his son got killed in the Korean War with all those soldiers who went there after just having got their country, and then the first thing they had to do was go get bombs dropped on them.
Yeah,
unfortunately.
Yeah, that's an incredibly valiant. And I mean, again, like the fact that the whole Korean War was so, because people often treat this thing as if it were something purely done for the US to stop Russia or just to stop the spread of communism. Like, it's so obscured. But it was both of those things in some weird way. But the thing itself was run by collaborators of Japanese fascists, by unreconstructed Nazis, by a whole program to destroy what could have been a very beautiful world of mutual development, win-win cooperation just a few years earlier, where U.S. delegations were fighting against Keynes at Bretton Woods and endorsing the New Deal programs for massive industrial development of China along the Sun Yat-sen industrial development plans from the Chinese delegation, and the same thing for India and Africa and South America. And all of these beautiful ideas were moving ahead very fast. And just to see the tragedy of how only a few years later, the U.S. was dominated by these traitors who were then using the power of the military to use it as a battering ram to just destroy the upward trajectory of China, which was working well with Russia in industrializing and ending poverty and doing these beautiful things. It's a real classical drama. And I mean, there's a lot of material for filmmakers and storytellers of the future to really work this stuff. And I would actually advise people to check out CGTN as well. They don't just do documentaries, but the Chinese government they've worked with the Chinese government to produce dramas. Have you seen some of these wonderful Chinese government sponsored dramas of this period and the battle in the Korean War and all these things?
There's a lot of good ones. There's that movie, if you're more like, maybe this is more something guys like, but there's the movie of the Chosun Reservoir one. Like it's basically one of the most highly funded Chinese movies ever, and it's just a few years old, and it takes place during the Korean War, and it's really good too. Like if you just look up like a China Korean War movie most funded or something like that, it shows up, and when you watch those too, they actually show it's just such a different kind of war movie because it actually deals with the human element a lot more, I find.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's one called The Sacrifice in 2020, which is super good as well, where it just shows you like anyway, that's actually leads me to the last question, which is, would you be able to send a list of resources, books, articles, videos, documentaries that you found to have high value? And that way, when we make this video available online, I will include that in the description box for people to follow up on and do a bit more digging on their own and come to their own judgments to see for themselves if this thesis holds true when explored on people's own terms.
Yeah, no, for sure. I can definitely send you some of that stuff, like all the most. There's so much stuff, right? Which he had said, and then it was like it's hard for me to say all of it because you can't just transplant to someone the experience of reading hours of someone's writing. You know what I mean? Like I'm trying to be like, oh no, I'm telling you, here's somewhere he said it was way too fast. But it's like you know what I mean? Like you remember reading it, but it's just so much stuff in your head that obviously you can't just transplant all of that. So I'll pick out some of the best, most reflective things. But those ones replying to the US, there were 4 in total at that time. They're pretty good. And then I'll find 1 or 2 where he really goes in on like the woke type people, describing them perfectly and explaining the problem with the way they think. So I'll find that as well.
That would be great. Yeah. And that's really an important topic to unpack. And I mean, I was just thinking about the parallels to what became the Frankfurt School misanthropic, nihilistic ideologues who gave birth to these ugly, deformed creatures like wokeism in our current day and cultural relativism, political correctness. A lot of this stuff emerged out of the George Lukács cult, who ran the Bolshevik government of Hungary and reformed the whole education system around sex ed and other things, demoralizing the whole school curriculum back in 1919. And there were efforts to try to get the same thing going inside this early Soviet Union as well. But you had, luckily, the moral statesmen who were able to rally around the figure of Stalin and push back against these Trotskyists and expel them from having any influence over the education system. And so to see a similar battle in its own form occur within the context of China as well around that same time, and just seeing Mao, I'm sure he was working with a network of highly, skilled minds as well who were able to identify this.
It was revealed to Mao that the Trotskyists were being directly funded by certain imperial groups and Japan, and Stalin had written something about Trotsky explaining essentially that they were like secret agents, and Mao knew about that, and it's included in the footnotes of his work. And then he expanded on that, and they somehow figured out that there were agents of Japan working directly with the Trotskyists, and they knew all of that stuff. Like they really knew the extent of it, which was why so early on that Chen Dushi guy, who went on to become a Trotskyist, a follower of Trotsky, was kicked out. And they call them dogmatic, and they talk about how they're intentionally subversive. But he also says that that's a very, very small portion, even of the students. There's a quote where he says, out of all the students, even maybe only 1 or 2% are followers like that, and we can work with them and explain to them how they've been duped, as opposed to saying like, oh, like root them out and kill them. He doesn't say anything like that. He basically says they exist, but he almost takes an attitude of it's almost like he has this confidence that through educating people on the right ways to see the world, like keep in mind, he taught people to read with a book, which was filled with ideas of how to think and how to reason, right? Like the red book was condensed versions of his own essays. And I've sent you, and we've read today some of the essays he's written. And it's like, imagine learning to read through condensed versions of a lot of those moral lessons, and not even moral lessons, but also lessons about how to better yourself by just recognizing there's some people who aren't there for your best interest, but at the same time, by working together with all the people who you can do anything, right? Like it's a very positive way to learn 80% of the population to read.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Lee. I very much appreciated you going out of your way to compose this and put this on the public record. So this is a great resource. We'll have this available in a few days, along with the resources that you send my way, and anything you have on Mao and Trotsky and Japanese infiltrators, any of that stuff you find, send it our way to Cynthia and myself. We'd love to see that. That is better than gold. We're hungry for that. Please send it.
Sure. And then the last thing I'd add is if anyone goes on that website, the search bar you might have seen me using, I would go on there, I would type in things like Trotsky, and that is where I would actually find that stuff. So you can type in a lot of things, some of them you wouldn't expect. Sometimes I will just do that. I'll type something in and think there's no way he talked about this. And then I'll actually find where he talked about Isaac Newton was an example, right? Where I was like, I wonder what he thought of these people who maybe aren't such good scientists. And then when I see that he's kind of basically saying like the guy was wrong, sort of, it's like it just adds little points in my head of, was his reasoning correct? You know, like, was he thinking in a good way, which leads to actual truth?
Absolutely. That's a good exercise. You set out a good set of homework assignments for people here following up on this. So thank you so much. And thank you everybody for taking this Wednesday night. And then keep in mind, Sunday afternoon, 2:00, we'll have Joaquin Flores delivering a masterclass in geopolitics with a lot of current events that he's going to analyze, but he's going to obviously, being Joaquin, break that down to some deeper historical and epistemological battles. So that'll be fun. Spread the word Sunday at 2:00. Thank you again, Lee. Take care, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.